For years, Helen Miller believed her destiny was to be invisible, until a mistake by the powerful made her see the truth. She knew more about that company than anyone else inside. Now was her chance to show that true power lies not in title, but in knowledge. The sun had not yet risen when Helen Miller crossed the mirrored gates of the imposing Thompson & Associates construction building. Her footsteps echoed through the empty lobby as she pushed her cleaning cart toward the service elevator. At 35, she knew every inch of that building, every persistent stain on the 12th floor carpet, every employee who arrived early, and every executive who left late. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," greeted Joe Wilson, the night security guard who was finishing his shift. He was one of the few people who truly saw her as a human being in that place. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. How was the night?" "Quiet, as always." "Oh, there's an important meeting this afternoon. The board will be receiving some foreign investors." Helen nodded, storing the information. After 5 years working there, she had learned that knowledge was power, even if no one imagined she was paying attention to everything. On the 15th floor, where CEO Richard Thompson's office was located, Helen began her routine. While cleaning, she could hear raised voices coming from the conference room. It was too early for any executive to be there, but she recognized Mark Davis's voice, the financial director, arguing with someone on the phone. "We can't let this leak, understand? The Americans arrived today, and we need everything to look perfect. Team, no, doctor, those numbers, find a way." Helen lowered the vacuum cleaner noise, trying to catch more of the conversation. Her eyes narrowed while pretending to concentrate on cleaning the carpet. During years of night courses in accounting and business administration, she had learned enough to understand that something was wrong with the company's finances. "Helen, what are you doing here so early?" Mark's sharp voice startled her. He had come out of the conference room and was staring at her suspiciously. "Good morning, sir. I'm doing the routine cleaning," she responded simply, lowering her eyes as they expected her to do. "Do that later. I need the conference room impeccable by 2 o'clock. Understood?" "Yes, sir." While storing her cleaning supplies, Helen could feel Mark's gaze burning into her back. In the elevator alone, she allowed herself a small smile. If he knew that inside her worn bag was a notebook full of notes about the company's suspicious movements, he wouldn't treat her with such disdain. In the employee break room, she found her only ally in the building, Rachel Green, a veteran secretary, who had also been relegated to minor roles after questioning certain company practices. "Helen, you won't believe what I heard yesterday," Rachel whispered, serving coffee for both of them. "The company is in a complicated situation. It seems the numbers haven't added up for months. The American investors arriving today don't know that, do they?" Helen asked, already knowing the answer. "Exactly. Richard is desperate to secure this investment. Without it, I don't know what might happen to the construction company." Helen sipped her coffee, thoughtful. For weeks she had been monitoring the company's stock movement on the exchange. With her savings from years of hard work and a small loan she had managed to get, she had bought a modest amount of shares when she noticed their value was falling. "Rachel, I need your help," she said after a moment of silence. "Do you still have access to the filing system?" "I do, but why?" "Because it's time someone did something about what's happening here." The rest of the morning passed like a blur. Helen continued her cleaning routine, but her mind was working on a plan she had been developing for months. In the afternoon, when executives and investors started arriving for the meeting, she observed them discreetly. Richard Thompson, in his impeccable Italian suit, passed by her as if she were invisible. He was the same man who, 6 months ago, during the company's year-end party, had made a cruel joke about her appearance, drawing laughs from his subordinates. That day, something inside her had changed. "Someday, Richard," she thought to herself as she watched him enter the conference room, "you'll discover that you underestimated the wrong person." The sound of expensive heels on marble flooring announced the arrival of Ashley Thompson, Richard's wife and the company's marketing director. She stopped briefly, looking at Helen with that artificial smile she always used. "Oh, Helen, after you finish here, Richard's office needs special cleaning. He spilled coffee on the carpet this morning. Yes, ma'am, Helen responded, maintaining her neutral expression. When Ashley entered the conference room, Helen allowed herself a moment of contemplation. These people lived in their own world, protected by walls of glass and power. Little did they know that her invisibility was her greatest weapon. While cleaning their rooms, she heard their conversations. While serving their coffee, she memorized their secrets. And now, finally, the time had come to use all that knowledge. The meeting with the American investors extended for hours. Helen took advantage to reorganize her routine, ensuring she would always be near the conference room when important discussions happened. Through the glass walls, she could see the tense expressions and nervous gestures of the executives. "The reports don't lie, Mr. Thompson," said John Matthews, the lead investor. "We need more solid guarantees before proceeding with any agreement." Helen pretended to clean the strategically positioned plant vases near the room. Years of practice had made her an expert at appearing busy while paying attention to every word. "Mr. Matthews, I can assure you that Thompson & Associates is in its best phase," Richard responded, his voice overflowing with false confidence. "The numbers that seem inconsistent are merely the result of our aggressive expansion policy." Rachel appeared in the hallway, carrying a tray with coffee and water. As she passed by Helen, she whispered, "I got the documents you asked for. They're in your locker." With a discreet nod, Helen thanked her. Rachel had become her most valuable ally since they shared their suspicions about irregularities in the company. The veteran secretary, like her, had been a victim of the toxic environment created by Richard and his wife, Ashley. At the end of E. The day when most employees had already left, Helen headed to her small locker in the employee locker room. Inside a simple folder, she found copies of financial reports that Rachel had managed to access. Sitting on a worn wooden bench, she began to analyze the numbers. "My God," she muttered to herself. The situation was even worse than she had imagined. The documents revealed a series of suspicious transactions and accounting manipulations that went far beyond a simple expansion policy. Her cell phone vibrated, a message from Edward Mitchell, her accounting course professor, who had become a mentor and confidant. "I saw the movements you mentioned. The stocks continue to fall. Is it time to act?" Helen took a deep breath before responding, "Yes, I'll need your help with the contacts you mentioned." Edward had been instrumental in her preparation. Besides regular classes, he had introduced her to some small investors who also suspected Thompson & Associates practices. With his guidance, Helen had begun to build a network of allies that could be crucial to her plans. The next day, the tension in the office was palpable. The American investors had left without closing the deal, and Richard Thompson was furious. Helen observed him having a rage fit in his office, throwing papers and yelling on the phone. "Ashley, you need to use your press contacts," he vociferated. "We can't let these speculations about our financial situation spread." Helen continued her work, moving silently through the corridors. During lunch, she met with Rachel at a cafe a few blocks from the office. It was risky to talk inside the company. "The Americans weren't the only ones to back out," Rachel informed, lowering her voice. 3 other potential investors cancelled meetings for next week. "And the stocks fell another 12% this morning." Helen nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "Rachel, I need you to do one more thing for me. There's a specific file in the system, dated 3 months ago. It's a transfer authorized by Mark Davis." "The one to the Cayman Islands account?" Rachel asked, her eyes widening. "Helen, that's pure dynamite. If anyone finds out we're accessing these files..." "No one will find out. You're invisible to them, just like me. It's our biggest advantage." Back at the office, Helen noticed unusual movement on the executive floor. Ashley Thompson was meeting with the marketing team, clearly trying to develop fair strategy to control damage to the company's image. "We need a strong story," Ashley was saying, her voice carrying through the glass walls. "Something that shows we're more than numbers in a report." Helen smiled internally. If Ashley knew that the numbers were exactly the problem, she wouldn't be worried about stories. At the end of the workday, while cleaning Richard's office, Helen found a partially destroyed document in the trash. Carefully, she collected the pieces, storing them in her pocket. Later, at home, she would spend hours reconstructing that puzzle. Her small apartment had transformed into an improvised operations center. The bedroom walls were covered with notes, newspaper clippings, and graphs showing the company's falling stock. On her desk, a used laptop, a gift from Edward, contained detailed spreadsheets with all the information she had collected over the past few months. Soon, she thought as she organized her most recent discoveries, everyone will understand that appearances are deceiving, and that sometimes true power is in the hands of those they least expect. Ashley Thompson hadn't always been the powerful marketing director everyone knew. 20 years ago, she was just another intern trying to survive in the competitive corporate world. That morning, as she watched Helen clean her office, old and uncomfortable memories began to surface in her mind. "Can you stop for a moment, Helen?" Ashley asked, surprising even herself with the request. Helen raised her eyes, maintaining her usual neutral expression. "Yes, Mum." "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," Ashley began, her voice carrying a different tone than usual. "A woman who also worked in cleaning, at the company where I did my first internship." Helen remained silent, but her attentive eyes didn't miss any detail of Ashley's sudden change in behavior. "Her name was Mrs. Johnson," Ashley continued, lost in her memories. "She was the only person who helped me when I discovered that my supervisor was trying to take credit for a project I had developed." A brief flash of interest crossed Helen's face. "And what happened, ma'am?" "Mrs. Johnson had evidence. She had found important documents while cleaning his room late at night. Thanks to her, I managed to present my project directly to the board." Ashley paused, a bitter smile forming on her lips. "That's how I met Richard." The silence that followed, it was heavy with unspoken meanings. Helen continued her work, but her mind was quickly processing this new information. Ashley Thompson wasn't just the arrogant wife of the company owner. There was a story there, layers of complexity that no one suspected. "Did you keep in touch with Mrs. Johnson?" Helen asked, carefully calculating her words. Ashley's face hardened. Again. "No. People change, Helen. Sometimes we need to forget who we were to become who we need to be." At that moment, Mark Davis burst through the door, interrupting the conversation. "Ashley, we need you in the conference room now. The numbers from last quarter leaked to the press." The moment of vulnerability had passed. Ashley immediately reassumed her usual posture, following Mark without looking back. Helen remained in the room for a few minutes, reflecting on the unexpected conversation. There was something there that could be useful for her plans. During lunch, she shared the conversation with Rachel at their usual meeting place, a few blocks away from the office. "Ashley wasn't always like this," Rachel commented, absent-mindedly, stirring her coffee. "When she started at the company, she was different, but Richard, he has a way of changing people." "How so?" "He finds their weaknesses, their deepest ambitions, and uses that. That's how he built his empire. Not just with money and power, but by manipulating people." Helen made some notes in her notebook. "Rachel, I need you to find out more about this story, about when Ashley started at the company, about this project she mentioned. It's going to be difficult. Files that old, but not impossible, right?" Helen smiled, knowing her friend never refused a challenge. Back at the office, the atmosphere was even tenser. The leak of the numbers to the press had caused real pandemonium. Employees whispered in the corridors, and the stock price continued in free fall. Helen took advantage of the confusion to approach Richard Thompson's office. He was on the phone, gesticulating furiously. "I don't care how, Thomas. Find who leaked these numbers and resolve this. I didn't build this empire to see everything crumble because of a traitor." While pretending to clean the windows, Helen observed Richard's expressions through the glass reflection. There was something different in his eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was fear. At the end of the day, when most employees had already left, Helen made her last round. In Ashley's office, she found something interesting. An old, partially torn photo, forgotten under a pile of papers. In it, a young Ashley smiled next to a lady in a blue uniform. Could it be Mrs. Johnson? At home, Helen added her discoveries of the day to her investigation board. Ashley's words about forgetting who we were echoed in her mind. Perhaps the key to unraveling the present was hidden in the past. Her phone vibrated, a message from Edward. The small investors are ready. When you give the signal, they'll start buying. Helen smiled. The pieces were moving exactly as planned. But now there was a new variable in the equation, Ashley Thompson's past. And something told her that this story still held surprises that could change the whole game. The Thompson and Associates office was buzzing with rumors about a possible intervention by minority shareholders. Helen observed everything with redoubled attention, especially after her revealing conversation with Ashley. The corridors were full of nervous executives whispering and exchanging worried glances. "Did you see who arrived?" Rachel asked, discreetly approaching Helen as she cleaned the reception windows. "Thomas Meyer, Richard's personal lawyer. He never shows up here without a good reason." Helen observed the man in an impeccable suit crossing the lobby. Thomas Meyer carried a black leather briefcase and a grave expression that didn't match his usual air of superiority. "I got more information about Ashley's past," Rachel continued, lowering her voice even more. "That project she mentioned? It was a complete restructuring plan for the company where she interned, the same model that Richard later implemented here when he took control. So that's how he built his empire? Using her ideas?" "Apparently. But there's more. I found records of an employee named Susan Johnson, who worked there at the same time. She suddenly resigned right after Ashley was promoted." The sound of heels on marble flooring interrupted the conversation. Ashley was approaching, accompanied by a woman Helen had never seen before. The stranger was about 60 years old and wore an elegant grey suit. "Rachel," Ashley called, her voice tense. "Prepare the 15th floor conference room and make sure no one interrupts us." As Rachel hurried to comply with the orders, Helen noticed something curious. The unknown visitor was observing her with particular interest. Their gazes crossed for a brief moment, and Helen had the distinct impression that there was something familiar in those eyes. Later, during her lunch break, Helen received an unexpected message on her cell phone. "Meet me at the corner. Cafe in 15 minutes. We need to talk. Susan Johnson." Her heart raced. How had Mrs. Johnson gotten her number? And why was she here right now? With caution but driven by curiosity, Helen headed to the meeting place. The cafe was almost empty at that hour. Susan Johnson was sitting at a table in the back, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Up close, Helen could see the similarities with the woman from the old photograph she had found in Ashley's office. "You must be wondering how I got your contact," Susan began, as soon as Helen sat down. "Rachel is an old friend. She told me about you and about what's happening at Thompson's." "Why are you here?" Susan sighed, a visible weight on her shoulders. "Because history has a habit of repeating itself, my dear, and maybe I can help ensure that this time it has a different ending." For the next hour, Susan shared her story. She had been more than a simple cleaning employee. She was an informant for a group of investors investigating corporate irregularities. Ashley, without knowing this, had trusted her and shared her revolutionary project. "Richard Thompson was nothing before he met Ashley," Susan explained. "He was just another junior executive with oversized ambitions. But when he saw her project, he saw an opportunity." "And you have proof of this?" Susan smiled, taking a flash drive from her purse. "I have much more than that. I have documents, emails, recordings. I've kept everything for all these years, waiting for the right moment." "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because you remind me of Ashley, before Richard transformed her into what she is today. Intelligent, determined, underestimated by everyone. But unlike her, you seem to know exactly what you're doing." Helen took the flash drive, feeling the weight of the responsibility it represented. "You risked a lot keeping this information." "Sometimes we need to risk everything to do the right thing," Susan responded, standing up. "Use this wisely. And remember, Ashley is not your enemy. She's just another victim of the very system she helped create." Back at the office, Helen could barely contain her anxiety to examine the contents of the flash drive, but before she could do anything, she was surprised by Mark Davis in the hallway. "Helen, I need you to clean my office now," he ordered, his tone more threatening than Normal. And don't forget to empty the trash. Today. There was something in his eyes that made her realize he suspected something. But what? And how much did he really know? In his office, Mark began frantically searching through drawers and files. Helen observed him through the reflection of the windows she pretended to clean, her heart beating fast. The flash drive weighed in her pocket like lead. A new message arrived on her cell phone. It was Edward. "The investors are restless. We need to act soon." Helen took a deep breath. With Susan's information, perhaps she could accelerate her plans. But she would need to be even more careful now. Mark Davis was on alert, and she couldn't make any false moves. The next morning, Thompson and Associates was in an uproar. The main economic newspapers had published articles speculating about a possible hostile takeover attempt of the company. Richard Thompson had called an emergency meeting with the entire board. Helen arrived earlier than usual, determined not to miss any detail of that crucial day. The flash drive that Susan had given her had revealed much more than she expected. Documents that proved how Richard had systematically appropriated Ashley's ideas at the beginning of her career, using them as a basis to build his empire. "Helen!" Rachel called discreetly from inside an empty room. "You need to see this." On her tablet, Rachel showed the latest stock quote for the company. They had plummeted another 15% since the market opened. But the most interesting thing was a pattern that was beginning to form. Small investors were systematically buying the devalued stocks. "It's them, isn't it?" Rachel asked, referring to the group of investors that Edward had organized. "Is the plan working?" Helen nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Each piece is moving exactly as we planned, but now comes the most delicate part." On the 15th floor, the tension was palpable. Through the glass walls, Helen could see Richard gesticulating furiously while talking on the phone. Ashley was sitting in a corner of the room, her face paler than normal, frantically leafing through a folder of documents. "I don't care what it costs," Richard shouted into the phone. "Buy back those shares. We can't lose control of the company." Mark Davis hurriedly entered the room, whispering something in Richard's ear that made him turn pale. Helen continued her cleaning work, strategically, moving to get closer to the conversation. "What do you mean we don't know who's buying?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "And that group of small investors, where did they come from?" "They're using different brokers, different names," Mark explained, running his hand over his face in a nervous gesture. "It's as if someone were coordinating everything behind the scenes." Ashley raised her eyes from her documents, a strange expression on her face. For a moment her gaze crossed with Helen's, and something seemed to pass between them, a silent understanding. Perhaps? The day continued at a frantic pace. Helen observed as a procession of lawyers and financial consultants paraded through the company's corridors. During her lunch break, she met again with Susan at the corner cafe. "Were the documents useful?" the lady asked, her eyes shining with a mixture of concern and expectation. "More than you imagine," Helen responded. "But I need to know, why did you keep all this for so long?" Susan sighed, a visible weight on her shoulders. "Because I felt responsible. I saw Ashley change. I saw how Richard transformed her into something she never wanted to be. Maybe if I had acted before..." "It's not too late," Helen gently interrupted her. "In fact, I think the timing couldn't be more perfect." Back at the office, Helen found Rachel in a state of agitation. "The board called an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow," she whispered. All major shareholders were notified. It was the moment Helen had been waiting for. Carefully, she took an envelope from her bag and handed it to Rachel. "I need you to put this on Ashley's desk. Make sure no one else sees it." The envelope contained copies of some of the most revealing documents from Susan's flash drive, along with a handwritten note. "We don't always need to forget who we were to become who we need to be." At the end of the day, while cleaning the conference room after another tense discussion session, Helen noticed that Ashley had stayed behind, alone looking out the window at the city stretching below. "You've always been here, haven't you, Helen?" Ashley suddenly asked without turning around. Observing, listening, waiting, Helen stopped her work, feeling that a crucial moment had arrived. "Yes, Mom." Ashley finally turned, holding the envelope that Helen had sent to be delivered. Her eyes were misty, but her voice was firm. "Tomorrow at the board meeting, it's going to be you, isn't it, the person behind all this?" "You already know the answer." A heavy silence settled between them. Finally, Ashley spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "You know, I used to be like you before I lost my way." "It's never too late to find your way back," Helen responded softly. Ashley nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. "No, it's never too late, and maybe it's time for some truths to come to light." When Ashley left the room, Helen allowed herself a moment of reflection. Tomorrow would be the decisive day, the moment when all her plans would converge. But now there was a new possibility on the horizon, an unexpected ally who could change everything. The morning of the board meeting dawned with a different energy in the air. Helen arrived even earlier than usual, her heart beating fast with anticipation of what was to come. In her bag, besides her usual cleaning materials, she carried a folder with all the documents she would need. "Everything is ready," Edward confirmed by phone while she organized her materials. "The investors managed to accumulate 22% of the shares. With the votes of the other minority shareholders, we'll have enough strength." In the building lobby, Helen met Susan, who had arrived to witness the outcome of the story she had helped build. The two women exchanged a meaningful look before Susan headed to the meeting room. Rachel appeared soon after, carrying a stack of documents. "Ashley spent all night in the office," she informed in a low voice. "And you won't believe it. She was reorganizing all the old files, those from the beginning of the company." The buzz began as soon as the first board members arrived. Helen continued her cleaning work, moving discreetly through the corridors while observing the movement. Richard arrived shortly after, his face tense and pale, followed closely by Mark Davis. "Where's Ashley?" Richard asked his secretary, his voice betraying concern. "Mrs. Thompson is already in the meeting room," the secretary responded, hesitant. "She arrived quite early." Helen could feel the tension rising. Through the glass walls, she saw the board members settling into their places, while Ashley remained seated in silence, an unreadable expression on her face. At 10 o'clock sharp, the meeting began. Helen continued her work in the adjacent corridors, her presence as discreet as ever, but her ears attentive to every word. "Gentlemen," Thomas Meyer's voice, the lawyer, echoed through the room. "We're here to discuss an unprecedented situation. A group of minority investors has acquired a significant portion of the company's shares and is demanding changes in management." "This is absurd," Richard interrupted, slamming the table. "Who are these people? How dare they—" "I can answer that," a female voice was heard, surprising everyone. Ashley had stood up, her eyes shining with long-forgotten determination. "Ashley, what are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice mixing confusion and alarm. "Something I should have done a long time ago, Richard." Ashley addressed the board, her posture erect and confident. "Gentlemen, before we proceed, there are some truths that need to be revealed about how this company was really built." Helen stopped her work, her heart racing. This she hadn't foreseen. Ashley was taking the initiative even before her own plan unfolded. 20 years ago, Ashley continued, her voice firm, "I developed a corporate restructuring project, a project that became the foundation of everything that Thompson & Associates is today, but it wasn't Richard who developed it. It was me." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Richard had turned even paler, while Mark Davis looked like he was about to have a collapse. "I have all the original documents here," Ashley proceeded, opening a folder, "including emails and records that prove how my ideas were appropriated." It was at this moment that Helen decided it was time to reveal her own presence in the game. With firm steps, she entered the meeting room, no longer as the invisible cleaning employee, but as a significant shareholder of the company. "And I have more evidence," she announced, her clear and confident voice echoing through the room. The shock on the faces of those present was palpable. Richard Thompson looked like he had seen a ghost. "Helen," he managed to stammer, "what does this mean?" "It means, Mr. Thompson, that the time of invisibility is over." Helen opened her own folder of documents. As a representative of the group of minority investors, I have here evidence not only of the plagiarism of Mrs. Thompson's project, but also of various financial irregularities that occurred under your management. The board was in shock. Susan, seated in a corner of the room, allowed herself a small smile. Rachel, standing at the door, observed everything with a mixture of pride and admiration. Ashley approached Helen, stopping by her side. "I'm ready to testify about everything," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of silence. "About how the ideas were stolen, about how I was manipulated, about all the questionable decisions I witnessed over the years." Richard Thompson looked from one to the other, his empire crumbling before his eyes. But before he could sketch any reaction, Thomas Meyer, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen of the board, given the extraordinary events of this morning and the gravity of the evidence presented, I believe we have some important decisions to make." The silence that followed the revelations in the meeting room was deafening. The board members looked at each other, trying to process the bombshell information they had just received. Richard Thompson, for the first time in his life, seemed to have lost his words. "This is ridiculous." Mark Davis was the first to speak up, rising abruptly. "You can't believe the words of a janitor." "These aren't just words, Mr. Davis," Helen responded calmly, as she distributed copies of documents to each board member. "These are facts, numbers, and evidence, the same ones you've been trying to hide for so long." Ashley approached the central table, her erect posture demonstrating a long-forgotten confidence. "And I can confirm every word. As marketing director and Richard's wife, I had access to information that proves all these irregularities." Richard finally found his voice, but it came out trembling, almost unrecognizable. "Ashley, why? After everything we built together." "Built?" Ashley laughed without humor. "You built an empire on my stolen ideas, Richard. You transformed me into a person I no longer recognized. And you know what's worse? I let it happen." Outside the room, employees were beginning to gather, trying to catch fragments of the discussion through the glass walls. Rachel discreetly coordinated the flow of people, ensuring that crucial information didn't leak prematurely. Thomas Meyer, the lawyer, was leafing through the documents with growing concern. "This is very serious," he muttered, more to himself than to others. "Very serious indeed." "Gentlemen," Helen spoke again, her voice clear and decisive. "As a representative of the minority shareholders, I propose an immediate vote to remove Mr. Thompson from the presidency and establish an independent audit of all company operations." It was then that Susan, who had been observing everything in silence, stood up. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to add something to this discussion." She walked to the center of the room, carrying her own folder of documents. 20 years ago, I not only witnessed the theft of Ashley's project, but I also kept detailed records of all the irregularities that followed." Richard turned even paler, if that was possible. You were just the cleaning lady." "Exactly as Helen was just the cleaning lady here," Susan responded with a serene smile. "It's amazing how people like you never learn the lesson. Richard, you're so busy looking up that you forget to look around." One of the oldest board members cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I believe we need a recess to properly analyze all this documentation. I suggest a 1-hour break." As the board members retreated to an adjacent room, Helen observed Richard sink into his chair, seeming to have aged decades in just 1 hour. Ashley remained standing, looking out the window at the city outside. "Did you know this would happen?" Ashley asked softly when Helen approached. "Not exactly like this," Helen responded honestly. "Your decision to tell the truth, that changed everything." "You know what's ironic?" Ashley turned to face her. "For the first time in years, I feel truly powerful. Not because of the position or the Thompson name, but for finally having the courage to be myself." In the hallway, Rachel approached with urgent news. The press was already aware that something big was happening in the company. Reporters were beginning to gather in the building's lobby. "We need to prepare," Helen said, taking out her phone, "to call Edward. When the board returns, things are going to happen very quickly." "What happens after?" Ashley asked, a note of vulnerability in her voice. When all this is over? Helen looked at her sympathetically. We start rebuilding, not just the company, but everything that was destroyed along the way. Susan joined them, placing a comforting hand on Ashley's shoulder. Sometimes we need to completely fall apart to discover our true strength. The sound of doors opening announced the return of the board members. Their grave faces indicated that important decisions had been made. Helen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The next hour would change not only the fate of the company, but the lives of everyone present. Richard also stood up, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture. His eyes met Helen's, and for the first time, she saw something different there. Not arrogance or disdain, but a mixture of fear and, surprisingly, respect. The board members returned to the meeting room with a unanimous decision. Richard Thompson would be immediately removed from the company's presidency. An interim board would take command until a new management was established, and an independent audit would investigate all operations of recent years. Gentlemen, the board chairman announced, his voice carrying the weight of the unfolding history. Given the extraordinary events of this morning and the gravity of the evidence presented, we have no alternative. Helen observed everything with a mixture of emotions. Her plan had worked, but the final result had taken an unexpected turn thanks to Ashley's courage in speaking out. The truth, once released, had created its own dynamic. Mark Davis, seeing that the game was lost, tried one last desperate move. "And who's going to lead the company now, the janitor?" he asked with scorn. It was Ashley who answered, her voice cutting through the air like steel. "No, Mark. The leadership will be assumed by someone who understands both numbers and people. Someone who knows this company from the bottom up, who has seen its mistakes and successes, and who has the vision to correct them." All eyes turned to Helen, who maintained her serene composure. "Gentlemen," she began, "over the past few months, while discreetly buying company shares, I also developed a detailed restructuring plan. A plan that not only corrects the mistakes of the past, but establishes solid foundations for the future." Thomas Meyer, who was reviewing more documents, raised his head with interest. "Do you have this plan here?" Helen nodded, pulling another folder from her bag. "It's all here, including a proposal to create an internal development program that allows employees at all levels to contribute ideas and grow professionally. Like the project I created 20 years ago," Ashley commented with an ironic smile. "Only this time it will be implemented the right way." Richard, who had remained seated in silence, finally spoke up. "You planned all this from the beginning, didn't you? Since that party when you humiliated me in front of everyone." Helen calmly completed. "No, Mr. Thompson, that was just the moment I decided things needed to change. The plan came later, built with every piece of information you and your executives dropped, thinking no one was paying attention." Susan, who was observing everything with satisfaction, added, "It's interesting how history repeats itself, isn't it? But this time, with a different ending." The rest of the meeting was dedicated to practical aspects of the transition. Rachel entered and exited several times, bringing updates on the press movement in the lobby and coordinating with Edward, who would arrive soon for a press conference. When everything was settled, Helen asked for a moment alone with Ashley. The two women headed to Richard's former office, now just another empty office. "What are you going to do now?" Helen asked gently. Ashley looked out the window, her eyes reflecting the city's horizon. "Start over. Maybe it's time to create something of my own, something truly mine this time." "You'll always be welcome here," Helen stated. "Your experience and knowledge would be valuable in the new management." "Thank you," Ashley smiled, "but I think I need to find my own path now, just as you found yours." At the end of that historic day, as the last rays of sunlight tinged the sky golden, Helen returned to her old area in the cleaning staff room. Her uniform was still there, hanging in the small metal locker. Rachel found her there, contemplating that symbol of her journey. "Are you going to keep it as a souvenir?" "No," Helen responded, a soft smile on her lips. "I'm going to leave it here to remind everyone that we should never judge someone by the function they perform or the clothes they wear." Outside, the city began to light up, marking the beginning of a new era, not just for the company, but for everyone who was part of it. The true transformation, Helen knew, was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the historic meeting that changed the course of Thompson and Associates. The company, now under new management, breathed a different air. The glass walls that once created invisible barriers between employees had given way to open and collaborative spaces. Instead of fear and unbridled competition, an environment of cooperation and mutual respect was growing. Helen observed the transformation from her new office, the same one that once belonged to Richard Thompson. But unlike her predecessor, she made a point of always keeping the door open, a symbol of the new transparency policy she had implemented. "The first quarter results have just arrived," Rachel announced, entering the office with a folder of documents. Now occupying the position of Internal Relations Coordinator, she had become Helen's right-hand woman in the company's restructuring. "And how are we doing?" Helen asked, though she already knew the answer from the smile on her friend's face. "We've exceeded all expectations. The stocks have fully recovered, and the new investors are impressed with the internal innovation program." The program Rachel was referring to was one of Helen's first initiatives as president. Inspired by Ashley's original project, it allowed employees at all levels to present ideas and actively participate in company decisions. "You know what's most incredible?" Rachel continued, sitting down in front of Helen's desk. "That cleaning department intern, Julia, her resource optimization project was unanimously approved by the committee." Helen smiled, remembering herself years ago. Sometimes all someone needs is an opportunity to show their worth. The morning went on with a series of meetings. Unlike the old tense and hierarchical assemblies, now the discussions were open and participatory. Employees from different sectors contributed their perspectives, and each opinion was truly considered. During lunch, Helen received an unexpected visit. Susan, as elegant as ever, appeared in her office carrying a small package. "I thought you should have this," the lady said, handing the package to Helen. Inside was an old photo, the same one Helen had found months ago in Ashley's office, showing a young Ashley next to Susan. But there was also a recent photo, taken on the day of the board meeting, showing Helen, Ashley, and Susan together. "To remember that sometimes we need to look to the past to build a better future," Susan explained with a gentle smile. "Have you been talking to her?" Helen asked, referring to Ashley. "Yes, regularly. She's doing well, you know. She opened her own business innovation consultancy. She's helping other companies implement more humane and inclusive policies." The news warmed Helen's heart. Ashley had found her own form of redemption, using her experience to prevent other companies from making the same mistakes. In the afternoon, Helen conducted her first general assembly with all employees. The auditorium was packed, with people from all departments gathered to hear the plans for the next semester. 3 months ago, she began, her voice clear and confident. "Many of you knew me only as the cleaning lady who went unnoticed through the corridors. Today I'm here not just as president, but as living proof that talent, dedication, and integrity know no hierarchy." A murmur of approval ran through the auditorium. On the faces of the employees, Helen could see hope and pride, feelings that had replaced the fear and insecurity of Richard's times. "But the real transformation," she continued, "is not in the change of management or in the positive numbers. It's in the way we've come to see and treat each other. It's in the mutual respect, in the appreciation of each individual, regardless of their function or position." At the end of the presentation, as the employees dispersed, Helen noticed a group of cleaning staff who remained in the auditorium. In their eyes, she saw the same gleam of determination that once existed in hers. Back in her office, she found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a card from Ashley. "Sometimes we need to get lost to find our true path. Thank you for helping me find mine again." Helen smiled, keeping the card with affection. The company's transformation was just beginning, but the foundations were firm, built not on fear and power, but on respect and collaboration. A year had passed since the transformation of Thompson and Associates. The company, which now went by the name of Horizon Corporate, was preparing for its first annual Innovation and Development Convention. The lobby of the city's largest convention center was filled with employees, executives, and guests from various companies across the country. Helen observed the movement from a corner of the stage, mentally reviewing her opening speech. Rachel approached, tablet in hand, with the latest details of the event. All panelists confirmed, she informed with her characteristic efficiency. And guess what? Ashley just arrived. As if invoked by the mention of her name, Ashley appeared backstage. She was different, her face lighter, her smile more genuine. The success of her business innovation consultancy had transformed her into one of the most respected voices in the market when it came to corporate cultural change. "I never thought I'd be back on this stage," Ashley commented, approaching Helen, much less as a guest speaker. "I think we're all in places we never imagined," Helen responded with a smile. The event started punctually at 9 o'clock. Helen took the stage to warm applause. The audience was filled with familiar and new faces, including executives from other companies who had come to learn about the revolutionary management model that had transformed a company on the brink of collapse into an example of innovation and sustainability. "A year ago," Helen began, her voice firm and clear, "we were all trapped in roles that others defined for us. Today we are here to celebrate not just the success of a company, but the breaking of paradigms that limited human potential in the corporate environment." The presentations succeeded throughout the day. Employees from all levels shared their experiences and projects. Julia, the former cleaning intern, now special projects coordinator, presented the impressive results of her resource optimization program. During lunch, Helen, Ashley, and Susan gathered in a private room. It was the first time the three were together since the historic board meeting. "Did you see who's at the event?" Susan asked with an amused sparkle in her eyes. "Richard and Mark. They're representing their new companies, much smaller and more modest than this one, I must add. How did they react when they saw you?" Rachel, who had just joined the group, wanted to know. "Richard made a point of coming to greet me," Ashley replied. "He seemed different, more humble. He said he's been learning a lot from his mistakes." Helen absorbed the information in silence. The transformation, after all, had not only reached the company and its employees, it had touched everyone involved in different ways. In the afternoon, the most anticipated moment of the event arrived, the launch of the National Inclusive Corporate Development Program, a joint initiative of Horizon Corporate with Ashley's consultancy, aimed at implementing policies of appreciation and professional development in companies across the country. This program, Ashley explained during her presentation, was born from a story of overcoming and transformation, a story that taught us that true leadership is not in titles or positions, but in the ability to recognize and value human potential in all its forms. At the end of the day, as the last participants left the convention center, Helen made a point of personally greeting the location's cleaning staff. Their smiles and the gratitude in their eyes reminded her of her own journey. Back at the office, already night, Helen found a gift from Rachel on her desk, a discreet plaque with the inscription, "True power lies in lifting others up." Next to it, a photo of the company's old cleaning team, now all occupying different positions according to their talents and aspirations. Susan appeared at the door, ready to say goodbye. "You know what makes me happiest?" she asked with her serene smile. "Seeing that history not only repeated itself, but surpassed itself. You didn't just change your own destiny, Helen. You changed the destiny of everyone around you." Helen approached the window, observing the city lights. Horizon Corporate was now much more than a company. It was a symbol of transformation, proof that true changes begin when we dare to question the roles imposed on us. "What comes now?" Rachel asked, joining her in contemplating the night landscape. "Now?" Helen smiled, her eyes shining with the same determination that had brought her this far. "Now we continue building, not just a company, but a legacy. A future where no one needs to feel invisible to be strong, where each person can shine in their own light." The office lights went out one by one, but the glow of the transformations accomplished continued to illuminate the path to a new corporate dawn, one where power no longer resided in titles or positions, but in the ability to recognize and elevate human potential in all its forms.